Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. Over the next hours, we're going to spend some time with two different guests in studio. First hour, we're going to be talking about science and how that fits with Christianity. Is science even compatible with Christianity, or is Christianity compatible with science? What are we learning in terms of this idea of the God hypothesis, a conversation we've had more recently with Dr. Stephen Meyer? I think you're really going to enjoy that conversation. And if you have a comment or a question about science or scientific issues, origins, we are certainly welcoming those phone calls at 1-800-351-1212. Just as a program note, let me mention that an hour from now, we're going to have Dr. Jim Denison in here. We'll be talking about culture and other aspects, maybe of cultural apologetics. But this hour, we're going to be looking at it from a scientific point of view with an apologist who has been on this program with us a number of times in the past. Daniel Ray is now a full-time apologist with the Watchman Fellowship. And if you would like to know more, that's watchman.org. We have a link there. You may remember him as an individual that has a science degree, but also an apologetics degree from Houston Baptist University. He is the co-editor with Dr. Paul Gould, has been on the program on the story of the cosmos, how the heavens declare the glory of God. And if you love podcasts, he has a couple. One called Good Heavens, which I love that title, Science, Cosmology, Astronomy, and the Glory of God. Another one on Apologetics Profile, World Religions, Cults, Non-Christian Worldviews, and others. And so, Daniel, welcome back to Point of View.
Thank you, Kirby. Thank you for having me back. It's wonderful to be here.
You know, we've talked long before you joined Watchman Fellowship with the founder of Watchman Fellowship, and most people think of Watchman Fellowship in light of maybe your other podcast. They think of, if I have a question, and I've used this over the years, I cannot tell you the number of times where somebody asked me about a particular cult, religious movement, a particular religious figure, and I'll say, I may have heard a little bit about it, but I'll guarantee if you go to watchman.org, they probably have a profile on one of those individuals or maybe an entire article. So for years, that has always been our kind of go-to place when people have questions about somebody who came knocking at their door or somebody who was doing a seminar in their business. And that's still something that's done every day, isn't it?
Absolutely. We have the Watchman reputation has been built upon collecting non-Christian ideas, other worldviews, Islam, Mormonism, Jehovah's Witness, and then all kinds of other controversial doctrines and practices, things within the church, things that have been popular within the church that have non-Christian origins. We have a profile notebook that's electronic and in paper copy of over. We're getting close to 600 pages, and James says we're going to need a new binder here soon for it.
In fact, I have one of those binders. By the way, that's James Walker, in case you're not familiar. And he's been here. Matter of fact, last time we had him and some other people, you've been doing this kind of Christian-atheist dialogue, so that's another thing you're doing. So it is hard to keep track of all the things Daniel Ray's doing on an average day. So we will do our best to try to narrow it down a little bit. And what we're going to try to do is mention that now, because of you joining Watchman Fellowship, you've added a whole dimension about this issue of science and how we certainly as Christians can think about scientific issues. And if you see some parallel between Point of View and that, is the fact that you and I both had an opportunity recently to do an interview in different venues with Dr. Stephen Meyer, and that book is The Return of the God Hypothesis. Tell us what you found when you talked to him.
Oh, it was wonderful. If your listeners may be familiar with Steve, he's got a couple of books that came out several years ago, Signature in the Cell and Darwin's Doubt, dealing with the design in biology for the most part. And then his new book, The Return of the God Hypothesis, is focused on cosmology. And in my talk with him, I learned that the book was birthed out of his preparation for a debate with secular cosmologist Lawrence Krauss. And Steve, as usual, in his typical fashion, is so incredibly thorough with his bibliography and his index and his notes. He has ratcheted up the game. This is, as a skeptic Michael Shermer has recently said of Stephen, this is not your father's creationism. You know, this is sophisticated, scientific, thorough, vetted, and well written. It was an enjoyable book I read in a week in preparing for the podcast and talking to Steve. Absolutely a solid case for Christian theism in the sciences.
And I might just mention that the book is, to be honest, tough sledding if you don't have a good scientific background. But the good thing about him is that he still has figured out how to give you at least enough in each one of the chapters to put the cookies on the lowest shelf that you can read through that. And I guess let's, if we can for a minute, because this is kind of a launching into all the things you've done in cosmology, recognize that, up until about the 19th century, I think it's fair to say there was what was called a design argument. You have William Paley, you have all sorts of people saying when we see design in nature, well, a design implies a designer. When we look at Romans 1, the Apostle Paul makes a very strong case for the fact that there is design, and that shows God's handiwork. But something happened in the 19th century. Charles Darwin, Sigmund Freud, and a variety of other individuals that he mentions, Karl Marx, if you want to get into that one as well. And so by the end, really, of the 19th century, there was kind of this idea that, no, we've pretty much dismissed and demolished the God hypothesis. But then as people maybe didn't see it coming, more and more we learned about science, the more the God hypothesis began to spring up. And now in the 21st century, we have to say there's a whole lot more evidence for design than there ever was back even in the 19th century.
Absolutely. And in fact, the secularization, if you want to call it that, that led up to what you had said, Charles Darwin, Charles Lyell, the late 19th century scientists, actually had a genesis back in the 17th century with the Enlightenment. Even within Protestantism, there were seeds of this problem. I mean, you may have heard of William Draper and Andrew White, who wrote these books that are oftentimes referenced, that are said to have originated the conflict between science and theology. But what Draper and White were really doing were espousing a kind of liberal Protestantism that elevated science above theology, that science became the lens through which we looked at scriptures. So their theology was very liberal. We were going to throw away miracles and everything else. And so the atheists kind of took this and they ran with it. Skeptics did. They said, why don't you just go one step further and use science to eliminate the Bible completely? And so and this is the time of Darwin and everything going on. And so you do have this setup to where we're now going to look at Scripture through the lens of science. Science becomes not the helpmeet of theology, theology being the queen of sciences. Science usurps the throne and now becomes the lens through which we start to see everything, including the idea that we can use science to dismiss God. But when we're talking about science, Kerby, I think a definition is in order. Just a methodological way of investigating the universe. It's a method, and it has no capacity to disprove God's existence, because the scientist would have to know what God is like in order to be able to say the data disproves God's existence.
I think so. And a little bit later, I want to get into another aspect, which I know you are certainly willing to discuss. And that is, we've been hearing this phrase a lot this last year. Well, the science says, or trust the science. And I thought it was just kind of interesting, because when you get into this, we begin to recognize that sometimes people are suggesting that science can answer questions that true scientists recognize they never can. But let's take a break, and we're going to get into some of these conversations as we go along. We've already got our first phone call. So, by the way, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Privileged to have Daniel Ray in studio with us today, and we'll continue our conversation with him, and then, of course, with you right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Earlier this week, I talked about the rising crime rate, but there is an element that is different. Lee Smith explains that sometimes street violence has been used as a political tool. To understand this, we need only to look to Arab countries where street violence is used to keep the faithful in line. That may be an explanation for what has been happening in America. Pro-Palestinian demonstrators were attacking Jews in major cities like New York and Los Angeles. Why would they be attacking American Jews in this country if their anger was toward the nation of Israel? Some say this shows that the tensions in the Middle East have to do more with religion than what is happening in Gaza or the West Bank. While that may be true, Lee Smith argues that these protests are really a political tool used to keep Democrats in line. That explains the diversity of the groups protesting. He acknowledged that it makes no sense that activists from the LGBT wing show up in support of the pro-Palestinian wing, but these different groups actually do have a goal, and that is upholding the Democratic Party. When LGBT activists are called to demonstrate on behalf of Islamic terrorists, they show up to fly the flag not for Hamas, but for Democrats. He also notes that these groups rarely campaign in rural America or even in suburban America. Of course, they may have a fear of meeting a well-armed citizenry, but the greater desire may indeed be to keep the party faithful in line. I've never really thought about why these riots and protests surface in only certain areas of the country. Lee Smith's perspective helps provide a partial explanation for why riots and protests are found in certain cities and not in others. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, we'll get to some phone calls in just a minute, 1-800-351-1212. But we have in studio with us today Daniel Ray, and we were talking about the book by Dr. Stephen Meyer, and it looks like in just a minute with one of the calls that is coming in, we might end up recommending another Stephen Meyer book, but it really breaks down to 3 points. I mean, I recognize you can't summarize a book that thick with 3 points, but I think the points are, number one, that now because of cosmology, we recognize the physical universe had a beginning. And we can have debates about the age and all the rest, but you always had the assumption in the past that if the universe is eternal, I don't have to ask where it came from. And all of a sudden now, when you have this idea that the universe had a beginning of both space and time, that argument is actually very helpful to the God hypothesis, isn't it?
Absolutely, Kerby. And I think one thing for me that Steve does so well in the book is that he shows the best sort of arguments that are in cosmology today, and then offers and does a great job, I think, of steel manning, of accurately representing the alternatives to a beginning. So there are a lot of cosmological models out there that try to explain our universe without a beginning, and Steve breaks it down into basically two. There's a kind of a quantum cosmology or a multiverse or a many worlds hypothesis. And for me, I think the key seller here, and you don't have to be technically astute to understand this, that the alternatives to the beginning, our universe, space, and time having a beginning, are these scenarios of many universes or many worlds. So you have a string theory multiverse where there's a multitude of universes, an amalgam and a matrix of universes. And the cosmologists and the theorists working on this say that the mathematics gives them a reason to conclude that there are many yous and me's out there. Our doppelgangers inhabit the multiverse. Because if matter is infinite in the multiverse, then you and I have our atoms assembled in some other world because it just goes on ad infinitum. And so there's a world, Kerby, in which I'm on on that side of the microphone and you're the guest, and we're talking about cheesecake, maybe. But in all seriousness, that is what a lot of people are espousing. Now, if you're not a multiverse theorist, you have cosmologist Sean Carroll, who advocates a many worlds hypothesis, where the universe is a quantum wave function that has been collapsed, and many worlds have collapsed. So there's a multitude of yous and me's in that, and he shows that, and it's like, to get rid of God, in the words of physicist Paul Davies, you subtract one being from the universe, and you get an infinite multitude of selves. So it really does. But he's charitable when he shows these things, and he outlines the science about why our universe absolutely has to have a beginning in space and time.
And again, I would say for a lot of our listeners, they're saying, I've never had that question asked. But the good news is you have a whole section in his book called Conjectures and Refutations.
Yes.
And he takes on those kinds of things that might show up if you post something on Facebook or Twitter or whatever. But the first one is that the universe had a beginning. The second one, this is very familiar territory for most of our listeners, that we live in a Goldilocks universe. It's not too hot, it's not too cold, it's just right. It's not too big, it's not too small. You look at the fundamental physical laws, the parameters, everything is fine-tuned to such a degree. Even when you use the idea of fine-tuned to a knife edge, that doesn't even get the point across. And so you are really dealing with something that has completely been unexpected by an atheist scientist, isn't it?
That's correct. And the details, I mean, we've all, know what a radio dial is, where it's they're going out of phase, but you have to have a control. You listen carefully to tune into a radio station, and fine tuning is way beyond this. Imagine 1,000 radio tuners, each of them having to be specifically within a millimeter, and you can't adjust one without interfering, fatalistically for biological life in the other one. So there's a high level of improbability that the multitude, there's many tributaries feeding into this, but that you'd have such a multitude, like you say, of the arrangement of atoms, the matter, the energy, the forces at work, the weight of the atom, the force of gravity, the weight of the electron and the proton, and the arrangement of these things, all of these happening by chance. The more you add to the mixture, the less likely it is that this was just an accident. We had a top-notch atheist philosopher on our Atheist and Christian Book Club last month, Graham Oppie, and his best argument for this fine-tuning was that that's just the way it had to be in order for our universe to be here. But doesn't explain anything. It's just kind of a brute fact. And so when a lot of cosmologists and theorists look at this, they have no fundamental explanation as to where these values and constants and quantities came from. So they just sort of brute fact it. We don't need to explain it. That's the end.
The fact that we're here, it means that it had to be there, and otherwise. Well, I'll pick one more, and then I'll take some phone calls. And the third one is more biological, but it's still very interesting because we know a lot more from molecular biology that you have a digital code. And it wasn't until really Watson and Crick that gave us a little bit of an idea of the structure of DNA. But this idea of there being a master programmer, we talk about a DNA code. Well, a code would suggest a code giver. Certainly a program would suggest a master programmer. And he always loves to use the example that Bill Gates, I think most people know who he is, acknowledged that the DNA code has a level of specificity far beyond any code they've ever written for computers to this day. And again, to believe that all happened by chance takes a lot more faith to be an atheist sometimes than it does to be a Christian.
Absolutely. And Steve is quick to point out that we're not just talking about what the DNA is made of, the sugars and the phosphates and the proteins that it creates. We're not talking about just the stuff. We're talking about the necessity of arranging it, the letters, if you will, of the synthesis that goes on, the necessity of arranging pairs. This isn't just at the level of what's it made of. This is actually information, and the as Steve points out abductively throughout the book, the only source that we know of for such information is that of a mind. And so biology reveals the precision that was by no means available to Darwin about the cell. I mean, to Darwin, the cell was just sort of this gelatinous piece of fruit like you'd find in a Jell-O mold, right? It wasn't much going on there. It was very malleable. He had no idea of the specific complexity that Steve and so many others in molecular biology have uncovered. And so molecular science has no explanation for why this information, what's the source of this information, what's the origin of this information. Naturalism is struggling to explain it.
Well, let's take some phone calls, and we'll head out to the Good News Network in Georgia. Jonathan, thank you for joining us today. You're on with Daniel Ray.
Hey, Kerby. Hey, Daniel. Hope y'all are having a good day. Appreciate both of you men. But on with my question. I have a good friend. He's a little bit older than me, and was well educated, and even was assisted doing some professing at a pretty well-known Christian university on the East Coast. And he, despite his mostly good theology, humbly from what I can gather from my own, looking and learning, he insists on a, I guess the correct term would be theistic evolution, maybe, where he purports that evolution is the way that the world was made, but he obviously still gives credit to God for setting it up that way. And then kind of, it may be parallel, maybe not, take it or leave it. He also thinks that a lot of the Old Testament, specifically Genesis 1 through 3, but most of the rest of the Old Testament is more fables, tall tales, allegory, rather than literal accounts of what happened in history. So I'd like to hear your comments on that. I'm like I said, I'm good friends with him. I love him. I appreciate him, respect him, and we haven't let this separate us in any way. But I just wanted to, see if you had any comment on that, or any tips for apologetics, if you will.
Certainly do. And Jonathan, I'll let you listen, and we'll probably even, since we're coming up to a break, talk a little bit after the break. But let me mention that what we're talking about here is theistic evolution. Sometimes it's called evolutionary creation. You have groups like BioLogos that have promoted that. And frankly, that's the way oftentimes it is taught at a lot of Christian colleges as well. Well, since we're taking a break, I'll come back and let Daniel respond to it. But we did mention just a minute ago, certainly Stephen Meyer, Dr. Stephen Meyer, and he put together a book called Theistic Evolution. It's a really thick book. We did an interview with him, and so if you type in Theistic Evolution at pointofview.net, you can find that and see the entire hour. And when we come back from the break, maybe, Daniel, we can talk about that, because he assembled a number of people to address the theological issues, our Genesis 1 through, and I would say more 1 through 3, usually say 1 through 12, is that maybe just allegory or fable or myth. Then he addresses some of the scientific issues. Can evolution really explain all that we see in nature? And then some of the practical application of it. But we'll come back, and since Jonathan started the question, we'll talk about theistic evolution, and I'll turn it over to Daniel Ray. But we need to take a break. We'll be back right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212, talking about science, and in particular, we had a question from Jonathan, very good question, about what about individuals that may say, well, I believe that God used evolution, and I believe in theistic evolution, and there are certainly a lot of people that have been talking about this for some time. We had, of course, Stephen Meyer on our radio program, and that is back, I think it's November 21st, 2017. It's hard to believe that book has been out that long. So you can find that. You can type in theistic evolution, see some of the commentaries I've written on it. And again, I'm not going to break fellowship with somebody that may have a different point of view. Matter of fact, some individuals that we've interviewed over the years on this program maybe hold to theistic evolution. We just oftentimes don't talk about it. But help us out, because you are certainly a master not only at understanding the technology and the science, but you've also thought about, how do I interact with some individuals where we may have some disagreement, because you spend a fair amount of time interviewing some of the top atheists and even some of these different cultists and other things. So can you give us some advice to Jonathan and to other listeners about how to react?
Absolutely. I think the kind of headway that you're looking for is long-term. You have a relationship with your friend, and that's what we've been doing at the book club with atheists and Christians. We bring them together. We have our guests that are atheists or Christian, and we cultivate a friendship. We can actually say that we're friends with our atheist friends who come. We have regular book clubs. And so you have that foundation with your friend of friendship, which cultivates a safe place to have a dialogue about important issues.
Sure.
So you absolutely have that foundation, rather than it just being an abstraction in social media. You're yelling at somebody, you have your friend and you can talk to him about that. That's an excellent foundation. And don't short-term it, just for you to get your friend to change his mind. You think long-term relationship. So that's important. Keep that in mind. Don't burn out on getting it. Don't frustrate yourself with the fact that he may not change his mind. A personal anecdote in terms of how I deal with one of the primary objections to theistic evolution that I hold to, and this is a non-technical one that I find is very effective in beginning conversations. Kerby, scientists tell stories, and I don't mean that negatively, but good science communicators write. They have an excellent ability to write and communicate. Carl Sagan, Bill Nye, Neil deGrasse Tyson, whatever you may say of them, they're excellent communicators for what they do. They tell stories. And so the story of evolution is one that is kind of, it's a historical science, if you will. You have to look back over, allegedly, millions, if not billions of years. And I had the privilege last summer of interviewing Deb Harsma of Biologos, Dr. Harsma. Right. She is actually a cosmologist, a wonderful Christian sister. I'm not going to, have an argument about that, but I think it's important when you have this kind of disagreement to focus on what you do agree with your Christian friends in terms of who Jesus is. But one of the things I find problematic with theistic evolution, and this is just a very simple, down-to-earth experience I have had successful conversations with people, is to explore the stories of the text. We're talking about the text of Genesis, and you pick up any evolutionary textbook or popular science book on evolution, they're telling you a story. And I don't mean that they're lying to you deliberately. I'm just meaning that they are telling you a story.
Right.
And one of the problems that I've always had with evolution in general, not just theistic evolution, is the amount of stuff that they say happens over the course of billions of years. Let's apply biblical criticism to the stories of natural selection. People will criticize Scripture for being written decades after the events that are recorded in the New Testament, for example. But with natural selection, you have stories being told that happened billions of years ago, little evidence to go on. And so you might read a couple of paragraphs where the scientist tells you this happened and this happened and this happened over the course of 1.5 billion years. We're used to that language, but stop and ask yourself, how does the scientist know the details to that extent over that length of time? And I find that's a very excellent way to start the conversation and to get you and your friend examining the texts and the claims of science and of Scripture and comparing them with Genesis.
So again, just a couple of ideas. And, Dr. Norman Geisler and I years ago wrote a book called Origin Science, in which we said there's a difference between operation science, which is physics and chemistry. You do an experiment in the laboratory. You can observe observe it and you can repeat it. But when you talk about origins, you're talking about historical science.
That's correct.
And so you use a different kind of methodology. It's like CSI. It's like Sherlock Holmes. It's whatever it might be. It's trying to reconstruct the past from the facts you have at the present. And you don't have observation. You don't have repeatability. And there's certainly a lot of issues along with that. But I think, if nothing else, I do recommend to Jonathan or anybody else just saying, I'm still trying to figure out this whole idea of theistic evolution. How does it fit with the idea of creation or intelligent design or something else? I think this book that was done certainly a number of years ago by Dr. Stephen Meyer, very thick book, really he pulls together the best people trying to deal with some of the biblical material, some of the scientific material. But in the interest of time, let me go to another topic that you're sort of alluding to, and that's called scientism.
Yes.
Because in some respects, we live in a world today where if somebody says the science is settled, oh, how many times have we heard this? Or believe the science, it really brings us back to a problem that you have written about and have done blogs on in terms of scientism. Can you explain?
Yes. I did a 4-page paper for Watchmen recently with cosmologist Dr. Luke Barnes from Australia. And we talked about this, and we have a podcast on it on our website, on Apologetics Profile. The MIT physicist Ian Hutchinson defines scientism as science modeled on the natural sciences is the only source of real knowledge.
Yes.
It's kind of what I call colloquially zombie logical positivism, because it's an idea that reared its head in the early 20th century. C.S. Lewis dealt with it. The idea that the only kind of true knowledge, Kerby, is empirical, scientifically deduced, and experimental kinds that are tactile, that can be registered with the senses. But of course, the claim that science is the only real path to truth is not a scientific claim. So it has within it a self-defeating aspect to it. But there are people, Luke and I have talked about this. He has documented, Luke works with scientists who believe this. There's Lawrence Krauss, there's Peter Atkins, and several others who find that the only way through our coronavirus problem or anything is science. Listen to the science, trust the science, believe in the science. There's a lot of that being given to us with very little thought about what does that exactly mean, because science is just, as we said at the beginning, a method.
Just a tool.
It's a tool. It's a method. It's like saying trust the scissors, or the scissors are true no matter what. We don't talk about scissors that way. And science is just a method, and it's always changing because we're always discovering new things. And so the science is settled question is a kind of scientism that says, let's stop asking questions. And one of the fruits, I think, of this is I read in a popular blog by Sean Carroll a couple of years ago, who's a cosmologist at Caltech, I believe. And Carroll said that, in terms of the relation of the origin of the universe, we need to stop asking these kind of why questions, because Carroll claims these kind of why questions, why does the universe exist, why is there anything at all, are metaphysical baggage that we need to get rid of.
But they are metaphysical. And
they are metaphysical.
Science.
That's right. That's right. So scientism is a metaphysical proposition, not a physical proposition. But in order to get around what looks designed and everything, what we've been talking about is they just want a brute fact, like our atheist friend Dr. Oppie just wants to say the universe was just this way. Let's not ask any why questions.
And again, when I used to speak on college campuses, I would run into this sometimes, and I would try to help the students, at least. I was given up usually with the professors, understand the difference between science and what we know and what we don't know. And I said, imagine if you were trying to contact a tribe that had never been able to contact it before, and we still have some of those places either because of hostility or because of geographical isolation. And so maybe you were able to fly in something that they could actually see. Maybe you could even put a Jeep there, and they could use the best science to figure out how the Jeep starts, how to drive it, but they have no idea where it came from. Or if you left a package there, it came from the sky. They may even come up with some kind of mythology about where it came from, some sky god. But if in that package or in that Jeep you had a tape recorder, and if they accidentally pushed the button, it then actually spoke in their language, by revelation, they would then learn more about where it came from. And now that may be a corny illustration, but it's the difference between science and metaphysics. It's the difference between between your science telling us how the universe operates and God or the Bible telling us where it came from. And these are two different kinds of questions. But today, scientists that believe in scientism believe that science has answered all of our questions, which is really kind of fallacious, isn't it?
It is. Or the idea that the check they want to cash is, the blank check they want to cash is that science will eventually answer all our questions.
And again, I remember Carl Sagan years ago in Parade magazine. Remember that? He was saying how science can provide ethics. And I thought, well, there's a category mistake for sure.
That's right.
And you actually interviewed his daughter, right?
I had the wonderful privilege 2 years ago for the book club of interviewing Sasha. She was delightful. We just let her talk about her father.
Yeah, well, anyway, we need to take another one of those breaks. We'll come back and talk a little bit more about this. But also, before we end today, we're going to talk about some of the material that's available at watchman.org. We have that link there. So if you are wanting questions about science answered or maybe about various religions, it's all right there. And we have it linked on our website, pointofview.net. Be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and privileged to have in studio with us today Daniel Ray. Just as a program note, Dr. Jim Denison will be with us next hour, but we're talking about science and Christianity. But I thought for just a minute, before we get too far down the road, that we will talk about what is available at your website. And so if you go to pointofview.net, you'll see the first link that we have under your picture is watchman.org. Now, there's a lot there. First of all, we mentioned the fact that you have the Watchman Fellowship profile notebook, more than 400 pages of profiles of over 100 different religious groups. A lot of that done by James Walker and other staff. But in addition to that, of course, you can then see the conversation that you had with Stephen Meyer, if you'd like to hear that. And we just mentioned a few minutes ago that you have this Atheist Christian Book Club. And because you put it out on Zoom, you can actually watch the counterpoint between the atheists and Christians on some of these topics, can't you?
That's right. It's one of the most wonderful things that God has led me to at Watchman is facilitating and then putting our videos together to help people not only see our guests. Sometimes we're just starting to have atheist Christian guests on at the same time. There's a lot to cover in 2 hours, but sometimes even when we just have an author or even it's just our club members, the discussion is always lively. It's always respectful, and it's just wonderful. It's a safe place to learn and to grow and to hear and to learn about other perspectives and other people. And James, as James says, you think you have a good argument until you put it out to your atheist friends and you hear it back at you, and so it's a wonderful reflecting tool to iron sharpens iron, as Scripture says.
Well, and again, I think you've done a very good job of modeling this. You've got very close relationships with some of these atheists, and if anybody has listened to some of the interviews I've done with you, one time we brought one of your fellow atheists here, so we had a Christian and an atheist sitting across from me talking about some of these topics. So that is something that I would want to point you to. So that is, of course, at watchman.org.
You can also find it at atheistchristianbookclub.com.
And again, you have those links there, so we have quite a few links. Matter of fact, this will take you a while to work your way through. I would be remiss if I did not encourage people to click on the Story of the Cosmos. Of course, you can go to thestoryofthecosmos.com, but this is a book that you actually helped edit and put together, and you had a number of contributors to it, which were just outstanding, and there was a presentation that you did that some of us attended as well. But first of all, a beautiful book, kind of a coffee table book, but at the same time bringing together the fact that the heavens do declare the glory of God.
Absolutely. Psalm 19 was our centerpiece text, and we have assembled a wonderful team, and we just said, write something about how you see the glory of God in what you do. So we featured literary scholars, philosophers, historians, scientists in their field, including the Vatican astronomer, Brother Guy Consolmagno, and every author. The only constraint we gave them is talk about the glory of God in the work that you do. How do you see the glory of God in the universe? And so it's a multifaceted, interdisciplinary look at what Psalm 19 means. And so it's just one little diamond in trying to reflect what the glory of God means. So it was a wonderful project. We enjoyed it, and it's doing well, and I'm so blessed to be a part of it.
Well, and again, not too often that you go to a lecture where one of the individuals is an astronomer that has worked with the Hubble telescope and a cosmologist, and the other individual is kind of a scholar of, C.S. Lewis Tolkien and things like that, and they both speak. And so I just love the fact that you bring both the left hemisphere and right hemisphere together, both the science and the humanities together, and so it's just a fascinating book, and I wanted to mention that for
Thank you.
That as well. And then one other one we posted, and we didn't post everything because it would just take forever, but you can have an opportunity to see and this is actually a YouTube video that you have called The Compatibility of Science and Christianity. Right. And these are little vignettes that you've put together and edited so that you can hear from some of these scientists. Because I know, Daniel, one of the difficulties some of our listeners have is I've got this atheist friend, and he's really, or she's really into the science, and they're just saying, look, I'm a scientist, I just can't accept Christianity. And besides, are there any really reputable scientists that believe in Christianity? Oh, yes, there are. Yeah. And so this gives a chance for somebody who maybe doesn't want to read one of your books to just sit down and for a few minutes spend some time looking through that, because it's about 18 minutes long, I think it is. And so we're not taking a lot of your time, but in a very short amount of time with some graphics and some clips, you get a chance to hear how these individuals with very good academic credentials, scientific credentials, nevertheless believe that there is a correlation and a connection between their Christian faith and their scientific endeavor.
Absolutely. And one of the beautiful things I think that is, for me, in putting that video together, was that there's a variety of different ideas about what the physical universe is doing, right? We all have these different physical theories, but as Christians, we're not shooting each other over the differences in our physical theories about the universe. We have a black hole specialist. We have a string theorist. We have a binary star expert featured on this video. Some of these people are actually in our book. But we let them talk about Jesus and the cosmos and their scientific work and how the two, it's like you just said, the creative, the imaginative, the rational, and the reason coming together embodied in a scientist who loves what they do. David Bradstreet, a binary star expert, talks about how he, after 40 years, loves what he does.
Yes.
In studying the universe.
And again, we're kind of getting to where we were behind the Iron Curtain. I remember when Dr. Charles Thaxton, first time I think he spoke, was it in Poland or Czechoslovakia? I can't remember, but wherever it was, after he spoke, there was a person came up and said, a scientist and a Christian in the same body. I've never seen this before, and there is a sense in which, because of the push right now, that either you have to accept your science or you have to accept the Bible. And we send, unfortunately, kids off to school sometimes that they feel like that's that false choice they need to make. Right. But we're just about out of time. Let me mention your two podcasts, Good Heavens and Apologetics Profile. And if they wanted to sign up to get those podcasts, how can they do so?
Good Heavens is at patreon.com/goodheavens, and Apologetics Profile is at you just put it in the space bar in Google, Apologetics Profile on Podomatic. So podomatic.com, Apologetics Profile.
And the good news is we have some of the links here, so you can simply go to watchman.org, and there's a contact us. So first of all, if somebody said, I didn't get all this information, or there's a question I wanted to ask, but I wasn't going to be as bold as Jonathan to ask it on air, but I wanted to ask you maybe off air, you would certainly respond to that. And if they'd like to have you come and speak, again, they can connect you up there because you've got that contact information. And so if people want to contact you, the name is real simple, Daniel Ray, right?
That's right. It's the easiest email in the world, to dray, R-A-Y, at watchman.org.
Then so again, say hi to James Walker and everybody over there, because the work that you have done over the years has been invaluable, even before you joined, in terms of dealing with some of these various religious groups and practices and things of that nature. But they have certainly benefited by bringing you on with your interest in apologetics and science and your background, and so many things have developed since then. So it's just been great to have you in studio, and as always, I look forward to the next opportunity.
Thank you, Kerby, so much. It's been a blessing.
We are going to take a break, and when we come back, let me just mention real quickly that we have posted all of that information on our website, which is pointofview.net. My commentary today is about street violence. We won't get into it. Maybe we'll get into that tomorrow when we have our, if you will, weekend edition program, and we'll have Penna Dexter and Dr. Merrill Matthews will be with us. But we have that information there as well. And in just a minute, we're going to be talking with our good friend Jim Denison, and we'll be getting into some of these cultural issues, one of which is the remarkable shift in personalities and perspectives as relates to something as simple as same-sex marriage. If you go back less than 2 decades, most Americans said, we're not sure same-sex marriage is such a good idea. Now, virtually everybody does believe that. And so it tells us something about how some of these social movements are taking place and how to really think about some of these cultural issues that we want to address here on Point of View, but maybe aren't really being addressed very often here in your church. And so those are some of the topics we'll have. And of course, he produces every single day, Monday through Friday, the daily articles. We'll pull out some of that material as well, so that you know how to think biblically about many of these social, cultural, and political issues in our day. So we'll be talking with Jim Denison in studio right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is at Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook. At Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to be talking with our good friend, Dr. Jim Denison of the Denison Forum and Denison Ministries. I think you're really going to enjoy this, because at first you're going to say, why are you talking about this topic? And I think it illustrates what has been happening in our culture, because the topic we're addressing is the issue of same-sex marriage. And when there was a Gallup poll done a number of years ago, I think it was in 1996, you only found about 27% of Americans that thought same-sex marriage was a good idea. The most recent Gallup poll has it up to 70%. And you might say, okay, what changed? Are the arguments not effective? Has our culture changed? What about some of those ideas? And it gets us, I think, into broader issues about tolerance, pluralism, even if I can use this big word, postmodernism. So I think you're really going to enjoy the conversation, because we're using that to illustrate some things happening in our culture that we as Christians need to pay attention to. Jim Denison is in studio with us. Of course, you are encouraged to get his daily article. It shows up. It's a must read. And of course, he's the head of the Denison Forum, holds his PhD as well as Master of Divinity from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. And Jim, it is great to have you in studio.
Kerby, so glad to be back with you again today, my friend. Thanks for the privilege.
We're going to get into a little more depth, and sometimes we do breadth, sometimes we do depth. Today we're digging a little bit deeper, and I use that big word, postmodernism. I think people that have listened to Point of View probably figure out that it's the idea that there's no absolute truth. You have your view of truth, I have a different view of truth, someone else has a different view of truth, and so there's no absolute truth. And it does seem to me that that's maybe the background for how these ideas like same-sex marriage, homosexuality, transgenderism have changed. What are your thoughts?
Absolutely true. On a variety of cases. This would just be one. Another example would be evangelism is now the imposition of your beliefs on me. A majority of Christian millennials now say that's the case and say that they have no right to force their beliefs on other people, because everybody's belief is their belief. You have your beliefs, I have my beliefs. Let's just all get along and we'll be fine. Well, at the end of the day, I'm here to say, as harsh as this sounds, that's a demonic idea. And it's at really the heart of what the enemy is trying to do today, to tempt us away from the Great Commission and the call of God that he has for our lives.
Well, and again, we have this different view of evangelism. We just did at Probe Ministries, for example, this survey of over 3,100 individuals. One of those key questions, actually a section, was on evangelism. And you find very few young people, that would be Generation Y, so-called millennials, Generation Z, the iGen generation, do evangelism. And then when you do have some that say that they do, their definition is not what we call the gospel. Well, I tell people I go to church, or I tell people I believe God, or that's about it. And so there's a sense in which whatever you look at, this has really kind of changed. And this postmodern world says you do not have a right to actually even assert your values. I mean, one argument that I'm shoving my values down your throat. Well, I think the media has been doing that for some time, and a fair number of people have been. But even just talking about these ideas is enough to be offensive to some individuals, because the highest value is tolerance, right?
Absolutely so. And if you consider to be intolerant, then you've broken the cardinal virtue here, so to speak. And it's across the board. It's not just same-sex marriage. For instance, if I stand up for life today, I'm part of a war on women, I'm told. If I stand up for the sanctity of life all the way to natural death, I'm part of a war on elderly people in the context of death with dignity laws and so forth. If I stand up for the idea that life is sacred from conception forward, well, there's a whole genomic revolution going on right now that wants to argue for genetic editing across the board, even when that gets transmitted to further generations, germlines, all those sorts of things. So all that to say, this postmodern idea that truth is personal, individual, and subjective is really at the heart of the issues we're facing in this postmodern and post-Christian culture.
And again, you and I like to talk about how this shows up not just in the academic debates that we're familiar with, but it shows up in popular culture. Let's pick one. We have people that certainly know what Star Trek is all about. And remember what one of the cardinal rules in Star Trek was the Prime Directive. And that is that the Starfleet and those on the Enterprise could not meddle in anybody's cultures, their philosophy, their society. Of course, the joke is they were doing it all the time. Matter of fact, there are whole episodes of the Star Trek movie where that took place. But that idea of the Prime Directive, that you can't, if you will, assert your values or change values, or that missionaries are destroyers of culture, this has a lot more to do than just the issue of postmodernism and tolerance, doesn't it?
Absolutely does. It goes back to Genesis 3. Where the serpent says to the woman, you shall be as God, knowing good and evil. From then till now, that's the only temptation that exists, Kerby. You can see it in all these various manifestations, whether it's to steal this or lie about that or cheat on this. At the end of the day, you're in charge. Look out for number one. Be on your own throne. Be your own God. Nietzsche said the will to power is the basic drive in human nature, and he was right from then until today.
One of the things I want to hold up is your book, which is called Critical Issues, and it's 7 critical issues, but it's interesting, 2 of those chapters, 2 of the 7 critical issues, one chapter is on homosexuality, one is on same-sex marriage, and I think it illustrates the fact that we are dealing with an attack on kind of the biblical view of sexuality. And last hour we mentioned Sigmund Freud in passing, but didn't Freud kind of change the whole view of sexuality or something of that nature?
Absolutely true. That's a critical point to understand. So we think about postmodernism, as you say, as the denial of truth, which is itself a truth claim. No such thing as truth, and I'm sure of it, right? No absolutes, and I'm absolutely certain. We take that in philosophical terms back to Immanuel Kant, as you know, in this idea that my mind interprets my senses, and the result is knowledge, and your mind's different from mine, your sense is different from mine, so there can be no such thing as truth. Well, that gets to Nietzsche, who says, therefore, you can't impose your power on others, but then it especially gets to Freud, who says we are at our core sexual beings, and so therefore experiencing what we think of as sexual freedom, sexual authenticity, is the key to flourishing, whether it's for the individual or for the society. Well, that comes ultimately to bear in the 1960s in the so-called sexual freedom or sexual revolution movement, this idea that I get to express my sexuality any way I wish to do so because that's the path to my own personal happiness, and you have no right to force your beliefs on me. Well, you tailor that along with the legalization of birth control in 1960 and abortion in 1973, and you're removing all the hindrances to this so-called sexual freedom. On the LGBTQ side, it was a movement that began decades ago to normalize same-sex behavior. You think of Will and Grace and other movies like that. Then to legalize, as we've now seen, and now to stigmatize those who disagree, which is where we are today. But a lot of it goes back to Freud and this idea that we're at our core sexual beings, and sexual freedom is the key to happiness.
And again, a lot of this is portrayed as, well, just allow me to do what I need to do. And yet today, when, as you said, if we're sexual beings, we have the drag queen story hour for young children. And you can see that this has gone far beyond saying, look, you don't have a right to tell me who to marry or no have a right to tell me who to have sex with. No, we're going to now force our views on you, and we're going to stigmatize any kind of biblical view. So we've said some of that, but when we come back, I want to get into it a little bit more, because how do we move from normalized to legalized to stigmatized? How did we move from a very small percentage of Americans thinking same-sex marriage was a good idea to a majority of Americans? And so that's, I think, certainly a great illustration of a broader issue. So we're going to take some time to really get into this. And if you, of course, have comments or questions, or maybe wonder how to even address some of those issues, I hope you'll stay tuned and give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Earlier this week, I talked about the rising crime rate, but there is an element that is different. Lee Smith explains that sometimes street violence has been used as a political tool. To understand this, we need only to look to Arab countries where street violence is used to keep the faithful in line. That may be an explanation for what has been happening in America. Pro-Palestinian demonstrators were attacking Jews in major cities like New York and Los Angeles. Why would they be attacking American Jews in this country if their anger was toward the nation of Israel? Some say this shows that the tensions in the Middle East have to do more with religion than what is happening in Gaza or the West Bank. Well, that may be true. Lee Smith argues that these protests are really a political tool used to keep Democrats in line. That explains the diversity of the groups protesting. He acknowledged that it makes no sense that activists from the LGBT wing show up in support of the pro-Palestinian wing, but these different groups actually do have a goal, and that is upholding the Democratic Party. When LGBT activists are called to demonstrate on behalf of Islamic terrorists, they show up to fly the flag not for Hamas, but for Democrats. He also notes that these groups rarely campaign in rural America or even in suburban America. Of course, they may have a fear of meeting a well-armed citizenry, but the greater desire may indeed be to keep the party faithful in line. I've never really thought about why these riots and protests surface in only certain areas of the country. Lee Smith's perspective helps provide a partial explanation for why riots and protests are found in certain cities and not in others. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue your conversation today with Dr. Jim Denison. And again, I mentioned his book, 7 Critical Issues. So if you find yourself saying, I'd like to know a little bit more about some of these issues, you can certainly go to Denison Forum. We'll give that in just a minute. Of course, we have a link to that as well. But we've been talking about this idea of normalize, legalize, and stigmatize. John Stonestreet put it this way. He said, who would have thought that a little bumper sticker that had an equal sign would be enough to actually advance same-sex marriage? Because the argument was, look, you that are opposite sex individuals are able to get married. All we're asking is for those of us of same sex to be able to get married as well. Now, that appealed to so many individuals who believe in tolerance and believe in fairness and all the rest. And yet the moment, I mean, you know as well as I do, the moment that same-sex marriage effectively was legalized by Supreme Court decision, then all of a sudden stigmatize showed up. And there are people right now listening saying, well, I just believe in fairness. Well, I just mentioned a minute ago this whole idea of the drag queen story hour. And if you don't think that, if I remember right, reading the daily article, don't we have Kellogg's and a number of others actually promoting this as well? Talk about that.
Yeah, we absolutely do. So you're right. 2015, Obergefell, Supreme Court Justice Kennedy writing that this is in no way going to intrude on your sexual liberties or, your religious freedoms. Well, now with the Equality Act that we could talk about, we're seeing that clearly wasn't the case. And then the idea we just want to be left alone to do what we want. Now that isn't the case either. And our youngest children are being targeted. Kellogg's, in service of Pride Month, has come out with a cereal in which Tony the Tiger and the other Kellogg's characters appear, and they're making it clear that no matter your pronoun preference, you can't be put into a box. And they want you to champion LGBTQ ideology for children. Rugrats is coming back out, and one of the characters is going to be a lesbian mother. Blue's Clues and You, a Nickelodeon video, has come out. It's narrated by a drag queen. It pictures two husbands or two wives and all sorts of different configurations. It's even got a character, Kerby, with surgical scars, demonstrating that this character, a squirrel, I think, has had a sex change operation. And this cartoon targeting, obviously, children. Across the board, we're seeing this. We're seeing this design. The San Francisco Giants last Saturday were the first Major League Baseball team to have a rainbow on their logo and on their jersey. So it's an ongoing strategy that we need to know about and be able to respond to.
One of the other things we've talked about is that it doesn't stay there, because the argument was always, we just want, and as soon as you hear the word just, don't believe it, because we just want equality in marriage. But the moment we got that, then of course it just moved to transgenderism. It certainly went on to polygamy. The argument that was used to justify same-sex marriage could also be able to justify more than just one man or one woman, or two men or two women, and polyamory, consensual marriage. And so all the things that you have actually warned about in this book are playing out. And you saw that, but the average person, maybe a little more politically naive, just simply said, look, I don't really feel comfortable necessarily with same-sex marriage, but I don't think it's right for me to say that you shouldn't be able to get married. But there was a lot of baggage and a lot of an agenda that came with that, wasn't there?
Absolutely, and we're still seeing the outworking of this. Polyamory, many loves, polygamy, as you say, the argument for that, legalizing that. In fact, Supreme Court Justice Roberts, when the Obergefell decision was made, dissented and made that statement that the exact claims that could be made for same-sex marriage could be made for polygamous marriage. Now we're seeing that movement as well. Consensual marriage is the claim that anybody of any age or biological relation should be allowed to be married. And on the other side of that, and again, people think this is absolute hyperbole, but it's not, is zoophilia, which is sexual relations between people and animals. And we're saying, well, that could never be the case. Well, just a couple years ago, there was a documentary that won all sorts of awards called Dolphin Lover. And it celebrates a sexual relationship between a man and a dolphin. A New Yorker article, 6,400-word article, praised a man for going public about a sexual relationship with a horse. And again, if we're back to Freud and sexuality is whatever you want it to be, postmodernism, truth is whatever you want it to be, then what right do we have to tell you that you are wrong? Well, if I say that, I lose my religious freedom, my religious liberty, and you're going to indoctrinate my children across the board. And if I don't know this, I'm powerless to be able to stop it and to protect my own family.
Well, let's talk about then for Christians, because the argument then would be, even though the culture is going this direction, Christians should stay true to the scriptures. And what I see is sometimes as the culture goes down, Christians are a little better than the culture, but no different than where the culture was a few years ago. And so when we look at those numbers, moving from a number which was at 27% not so long ago to 70%, I think a very significant number of those in the 70% would be people that would be born again evangelical Christians who go to our churches.
Absolutely, and the younger, the more that's the case. So there are three approaches that we're seeing here. The one is to say the Bible's wrong on same-sex marriage. The Bible's wrong on LGBTQ issues. I actually heard a bishop say that we now know Paul was a homophobe. I'm thinking of the theologian Walter Wink, who said, I readily concede that Paul condemns, he called it condemn, same-sex relationships. What I don't concede is that Paul was right about that. So that's one side. They will say the Bible was wrong on slavery, which is another subject, and they're wrong about that, but they'll say that, and that the Bible was wrong on women's issues, they will say, and the Bible is simply wrong on this. That's one approach. Second approach is to say that we were wrong, that we're misinterpreting the Bible,
yes,
that the Bible never forbade what they will call consensual, monogamous, same-sex relationships. Now, they're wrong about that. On the merits, they're wrong. Historically, they're wrong. But you're seeing a great deal of traction among even so-called evangelicals in that space. Then the third position is that the culture is wrong, that the Bible has always said what it says, has always meant what it means. That's what the vast majority of the evangelical or conservative Christian world outside the United States believes. That's why you're seeing so many, for instance, Presbyterian or even Episcopal churches aligning with traditions and denominations outside the United States. Because in Africa, for instance, and in so much of them, so much more conservative on these issues than we are in America, Western Europe. But it's in our culture that we're abandoning biblical truth, not just on this subject, but everything else that comes behind it.
And that's kind of intriguing to find that in many cases, if you want to find a denomination that holds to biblical ideas, you don't go to the Anglican Church in America or the Anglican Church in England. You go to the Anglican Church in Africa. And yet that has certainly become kind of a universal phenomenon, hasn't it?
Absolutely has. A good friend of mine, a Presbyterian pastor, as they were going through their struggles in PCUSA around all of this a few years ago, seriously explored the idea of having his church be aligned under the Nigerian Presbyterian Association, because they themselves were being biblically faithful in these areas, and he felt like his church should be more connected to an authority that would be more in line with Scripture. So this is clearly not something that is happening across the board. It's just happening in our culture, where we're giving up biblical truth. In the Bible, God is a king. In our culture, God is a hobby.
Yes.
In our culture, we separate Sunday, Monday, spiritual, secular, religion, the real world. Where we're doing that, we're missing what God's doing. Where people are making God their king, they're experiencing an actual spiritual awakening these days. And that's the good news we can celebrate.
And getting back to that, George Barna, the last time he was on, was talking about some of the differences in terms of the views between the 6% of American adults who do have a biblical worldview compared to the rest. And years ago, he made a good illustration that sometimes you have a core of committed Christians, and then you have the general Christians. And he said, for the general Christians, Christianity is sort of like a hobby, but for the core of Christians, it's a lifestyle. And I think your illustration as well, king or hobby, those are all kind of illustrations. And so I want to take a break, and when we come back, I want to get into another aspect of that, because if you click on the website right now, first of all, you're going to see all sorts of great stuff for the Denison Forum, but you'll notice that our Take Action item has to do with the Equality Act. Now, there's some political implications to that, and I tend to be the political guy, but I know you've written about this as well, because the Equality Act and other similar kind of legislation, this is, of course, a national act, but there are all sorts of things that have been done at state and local levels, are some issues as well politically. And, of course, we've already talked about some of these popular cultural issues, whether it's Kellogg's or whether it's a drag queen reading programs or whatever. And if you find yourself saying, he's rattled off a couple of facts and figures and statistics or things that I've not heard, that's one of the reasons why we encourage you to click on his picture there. It will take you to denisonforum.org, and you will actually, if you just use the search engine, find a number of things that are documented in that regard. If you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212, and we'll talk about the Equality Act. What about the issue, though, of gender dysphoria? Because we've talked about that as well. And individuals that even talk about this oftentimes find themselves prevented from being able to sell their books on Amazon, prevented from being able to even have their interviews surface on YouTube and a number of other things. And just the whole reaction that Christians should have to a culture that obviously it's turned its back on a number of biblical principles and really adopted that free sex, sexual revolution kind of mindset. So if you'd like to join the conversation, we got a lot more to cover. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back with our good friend Dr. Jim Denison right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back on
Once again, kind of digging deep into an issue that we sometimes have addressed in the past, and we do so because we've seen the remarkable change from the fact that 27% first asked about whether or not they supported same-sex marriage, and then it went from 27% to 70%. And we've tried to, if nothing else, give you an understanding of some of the reasons why that has been taking place. And that's just one of many issues. But while we're on this issue, there is a political implication. And in studio with us is Dr. Jim Denison, and that has to do with what we have encouraged people to do, and that is to contact their senators about the Equality Act. And so this is a multifaceted particular issue that surfaces in the popular culture, it surfaces in marriage areas, and certainly in the church as well, but it is also a political issue and a good illustration of if we don't pay attention to this, we're going to move even more from legalized to stigmatized almost instantaneously.
Absolutely, Troy. I'm so glad you're doing that. We're doing the same thing. We've encouraged our readers and followers to write their senators as well, and we have to keep doing that because, as you know, this is still in front of the Senate today. Has passed the House twice. President Biden said he would sign it. In fact, he said it would be his top legislative priority in the first 100 days back when he was running for office. So the so-called Equality Act, just for those that may not be clear, elevates what's called SOGI, protections, sexual orientation, gender identity, protections to a 1964 civil rights protected class status, with no reference, this is the key, to the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. So what that means in practical terms is if you happen to work at, let's say, a faith-based hospital, today, if someone wants you to do what we think of as a sex change surgery, a gender affirmation surgery, you can refuse that on religious grounds, not if the Equality Act becomes law. If I'm, for instance, a resident scholar for ethics with Baylor Scott and White Health, I can tell you we do not do what we think of as abortion or voluntary termination of pregnancy, except to save the life of the mother or for severe fetal deformity incompatible with life. If the Equality Act becomes law and abortion becomes understood as health care for a particular class, protected class, we will be required by law to perform abortion, especially for LGBTQ individuals and perhaps for the broader public as well. If you're working with an adoption agency, you would be required to adopt children to same-sex couples. If you're working in the public sphere, you would have no recourse. What Hobby Lobby was able to do years ago would be defeated. Jack Phillips, who has been continually vindicated by the courts, the baker in Colorado would be defeated. So again and again, you would have no religious protection relative to LGBTQ issues if the Equality Act becomes law. And right now, it's if the Senate confirms it and the president signs it, it will happen.
And again, let's just see what's happening even without it being passed. You mentioned, for example, Jack Phillips, and whether you're talking about him or whether you're talking about the two bakers in Oregon, whether you're talking about a photographer in New Mexico, whether you're talking about a florist in Washington, whether you're talking about a number of individuals at bed and breakfasts and all the rest, any time when they wanted to assert their religious values, they have, in most cases, lost in the lower courts. And even with Jack Phillips, you might say, well, he sort of won. Well, he didn't really. He just has to keep going back into court. And so all of this is happening now. So for somebody saying, well, I just think that Jim Denison is overplaying his hand, maybe engaging in hyperbole, we see what happens right now in terms of the popular culture, in terms of the legal structure. Can you imagine what happens when that has the sanction of something like the Equality Act? And that's, of course, why you're so concerned about this.
Exactly, and it's the larger trajectory that it represents. Why are we at a place where this could be the conversation? Religious freedom is in the First Amendment. It's seen as our first right, our first liberty, as Kelly Shackelford would say. Well, there's this larger trajectory we've been discussing that says that freedom is mine to assert as I will, that truth is what I believe it is, and if you disagree with me, you're discriminatory, you're homophobic, bigoted, prejudiced. So now the culture sees me, because I affirm biblical morality, as though I were a member of the KKK, wanting to burn a cross in their front yard. They would say that my appeal to religious freedom ought not be allowed any more than a KKK member could appeal to religious freedom to abuse somebody who's a racial minority. I certainly wouldn't allow a KKK member to use our platform to write an article affirming white supremacy. Well, Google says the same thing about those of us that affirm biblical morality, or YouTube or Facebook or whatever it might be. So the larger trajectory it represents is that we that believe in biblical morality are not just the minority, we're the bigots. We're those that are prejudiced. We are those who ought to be opposed as dangerous to society. Richard Dawkins is saying that religion is a virus in the software of humanity that must be expunged. And the culture is more and more agreeing.
And again, one other aspect of this is the fact that you have some individuals that come forward and say, I really don't like the lifestyle I'm in, and I would want to change that lifestyle. Or I'm undergoing gender dysphoria, and I'm not sure whether I'm a woman in a male body or a male in a female body. I don't really understand. And they, in the past, would be able to go to a counselor, a pastor, and maybe just begin to sort some of this out. And we know that especially for teenagers and those in middle school, sometimes middle schools, they were really kind of figuring out who they are. So there could be a lot of help that could be provided. But with these laws, but even before these laws, with these sanctions being put on doctors and psychologists and others, the help that could be provided, even the spiritual help and the spiritual counsel that could be provided, is simply thrown out the door, isn't it?
It is, and in many ways placed as illegal. It's seen as the sort of conversion therapy that's more and more being made illegal today. In the UK, there was a group of bishops that came down again saying that religious people ought not be able to practice conversion therapy, as it's called. Well, what's inside that part of it so tragic about this, and a lot of secular literature is demonstrating this, 75 to 90% of young children who experience sexual or gender dysphoria, if left alone, will resolve to what's thought of as their natal sexual identity. In other words, they will decide that they are a man in a man's body or a woman in a woman's body, 75 to 90%. However, in our culture today, if even a young child has any question about their sexual orientation, their gender identity, the culture swoops in and says, well, then you must be what you think you might be. And so we affirm their changes of names and pronouns and clothing and even sex change therapies, so-called, a lot of which are irreversible. Surgeries, hormone treatments such as that. And the secular public is coming along that's in this space more and more and saying, we need not to do that. We need to pull back. We need to allow them opportunity to sort this out. And 75 to 90% of the time, they settle in with their assigned gender at birth. But we're not doing that in the culture. We're celebrating them. We're making them martyrs if somebody disagrees. And as a result, we're doing irrevocable harm to children all across the culture.
Well, one of the lines that came out of last hour is that we have this trust the science is settled. But if anything, in this particular area, you have people like Dr. Paul McHugh, who was at Johns Hopkins, who used to advocate for this and simply says this is not working. And as soon as he, because of the science and because of the evidence and because of looking at all sorts of longitudinal studies and all sorts of research that he has been able to pull together, starts to come out with those ideas, the politics is affecting the science. So really, even though we say we trust the science is going one direction, but the culture is saying we're going to turn a blind eye to all the science.
Because
Fair?
The science doesn't agree with my presuppositions.
Yes.
He's a great example. He looked at these longitudinal studies and discovered that gender affirmation surgeries are not producing the outcomes that were expected, that in fact suicide rates are just as high, if not higher, that depression rates continue at the same rate, if not higher. And now we have more and more people that are wishing to convert back and are unable to do so because of what's been done to their bodies. And so he came forward, a very esteemed scientist, somebody very much quoted in the field, until the science convinced him differently. And then all at once, now he's a heretic in the field because he's following the science.
Well, and one other individual that we've had on the program, she talks about the fact that among women, we have this kind of rapid onset gender dysphoria, which seems to be really created by the culture and by the social media and a number of other things. And yet here we have a reaction that says you can't even document this, even though you have. You can't even talk about this, and we're not even going to allow you to get your book or any other books related to this on Amazon. And so you find that this heavy-handed popular culture and social media prevents even an honest look at some of the science and some of the social science that's coming down right now.
Absolutely. Ryan T. Anderson has done marvelous work in this space, as you know. His book a few years ago, When Harry Became Sally, is in many ways really kind of the standard in the field. But as you know, recently Amazon, simply with no warning ahead of time, made it unavailable. On their website, to my knowledge, it's still not available if you try to order it through Amazon today. It's censorship in the worst form.
Well, again, we've talked about those topics and interviewed all those authors on this particular program, but we need to take a break. And so when we come back, let's talk about what do Christians do. Is it time just to get into our holy huddles and just simply give up at this point? Or can grassroots turn these kinds of things around? I will give you a little bit of a if you will, notice of what I think is going to happen, and that is that once we began to see the more aggressive attempt to stigmatize, a lot that were actually enamored with this idea of equality began to rethink what is actually happening in our society. So we'll take a break, come back, and continue our conversation with Jim Denison right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and in studio with us today, Dr. Jim Denison, and let me just commend to you the Denison Forum. First of all, you can go to the website, pointofview.net, and see a very good piece by Jim Denison on how does same-sex marriage affect you, and there are all sorts of pieces that are available, and it's just one of the many white papers and great material. Of course, I've mentioned your book, 7 Critical Issues, where you cover that as well. But the big question, and this is certainly the typical question that Jim Denison addresses so often in the daily article, is so what? What can we as Christians do about this? And I think by now there are some listeners saying, I'm just going to go find a home in Colorado or Montana. I'm just going to give up. Or we're going to stay in our holy huddle and we just need to withdraw from this fallen culture. And I understand that mindset, but it is getting dark because we aren't shining a light. So what about this? How can we respond to some of these issues?
Now, I love that metaphor. Jesus said, we're the light of the world. Well, if the room is dark and I've got a flashlight, The darkness of the room is ultimately my fault, isn't it? And so the good news is that the darker the room, the more powerful the light, the more attractive the light. I remember years ago being in Carlsbad Caverns with a tour group, and they get you down to the bottom of the cavern there. Then they turn off the lights, the flashlights they've got, have you sit down, and it's pitch black. Can't see your hand in front of your face. But after a little bit of time, the tour guide turns on his flashlight, and you can't help seeing it, being drawn to it like a moth to a flame. And it demonstrated again the power, the attractiveness of the light in the dark. Well, we're called to be the light. Jesus said, don't hide your light under a bushel basket. You're the salt of the earth. The salt's no good in a salt shaker. So retreating and withdrawing is not an option for biblical Christians. That's not the answer to the question. The other side of the spectrum, which is to be a culture warrior who's taking the culture on in almost an antagonistic sort of way, I think is not biblical either. Mm-hmm. The people we're discussing are not the enemy. They may be our opponents, but they're not our enemies. Ronald Reagan used to tell his staff, we have opponents, but not enemies. Our enemy is Satan himself, and the Bible makes it clear that he has deceived the minds of the unbelievers. And these people are deceived just like I have on occasion been deceived. And I'm just as broken as they are. I'm just as tempted sexually as anybody else is. My temptations are heterosexual rather than homosexual, but I'm tempted and I'm broken just as we all are. And so to get to this superior sort of elitist culture warrior, I'm going to go defeat my enemies approach is not speaking the truth in love. The middle position here is to share grace because I've received grace. It starts with building relationships. It starts with stepping across these divides and earning the right to be heard. It starts with praying and asking God to lead me to the people with whom he'd have me build these relationships and show me what to say and how to say it. It's every day being filled with the Spirit, Ephesians 5:18, asking the Spirit to manifest the fruit of the Spirit in my life, that I might be a person of civility, and then praying for the words to say and the courage to say them, knowing that God will use me if I'm simply willing to be used.
And again, there are some resources that we have access to. I was just thinking about when I wrote this book on homosexuality back in 2008, I give some suggested books in the back, but some of the best books weren't written back then. And you mentioned, of course, Ryan Anderson's been on the program with us, and we can get to so many other guests on that regard. So whether it's biblical apologetics, how to defend the Bible, or cultural apologetics, how to address those issues, that's one of the reasons why I encourage people all the time to go on Denison Forum. Because you try to pull the facts and figures together and then kind of give us our marching orders. And you're familiar with James Davidson Hunter. He's been on the program with us before. And his philosophy is that we certainly do have an influence from the top down. And it would be good to get very dedicated Christians who maybe are listening right now to go and get the right degrees and go and make a difference. Or maybe they're already in positions of authority. But there is also a place not only from the top down, but from the bottom up and a grassroots. So any of our listeners have the ability to simply find some of this material and share it. And it could be on Facebook, it could be on Twitter, it could be just over coffee with a neighbor or a family member, or especially to really reach out to the younger generation, because sadly, the younger you are, the more likely you are to say, well, homosexuality is just an alternative lifestyle. Same-sex marriage is really no different than biblical marriage. And so in some respects, we have a responsibility to pass the biblical baton on from one generation to the next.
Absolutely. It's Deuteronomy 6. It's teaching these things to your children when you lie down and when you rise up. Really three ways, and you've described this, that you and I can do this in an unprecedented way. Never been the case in American history that this cell phone in my hand can give me the ability and the platform through social media and other means to be able to speak to the world. Every person that has access to Facebook or YouTube can make clear biblical truth through their own story. It's John 9 with the man that was born blind that was healed by Jesus. And he said, this is the one thing I know. I was blind and now I see. We have that ability now, each of us individually. We have the ability to interact with our elected officials on a level that most of us take for granted. I've been privileged to pastor over the years a number of people in service and in public office. And they say that citizens completely, drastically underestimate the influence they can have with a letter, with an email, with a phone call. Those that are in that office, whether it's mayor, city council, school board, all the way to governor, president, assume that for every letter they get, there are thousands of people who agree that just haven't written. So you have an enormous ability to reach out. You can befriend your city council member and your school board member. You can go to city hall meetings and school board meetings. In our own neighborhood, there was a desire to bring a poker club into our community. And a word got out. And immediately my wife and others began writing and voicing increasing concern. And next thing we know, the city council is taking action as we wanted them to take action. And so you have that kind of ability. And then most of all, we know this, but we need to keep reminding ourselves when we pray. The Holy Spirit uses us to do things we cannot imagine on earth and in heaven. This is ultimately a spiritual battle, and we fight it on our knees. So we ought every day to be praying for the kind of spiritual awakening our culture so desperately needs.
Well, again, I would encourage you to pray about these issues. Pray for Denison Forum, but we are coming to the end of the fiscal year, which is June 30th, and I would encourage people to consider supporting you as well, because let's just, for example, point out the fact that we're making available today this wonderful piece that you put together, How Does Same-Sex Marriage Affect You? 36 pages. Now, you're going to get it for free. Now, if you get the book, it's a few bucks, but it's still not much. And if you believe that it's important to actually educate the next generation and to educate the leaders, because I know you're reaching out to a lot of thought leaders, including pastors. You have this incredible outreach to pastors and others. I would encourage people to support you at Denison Forum. So talk about what they will find if they click on this little button that says denisonforum.org. What's available there?
Thank you, Kerby. 12 years ago, we started this ministry so that I could devote full-time attention to speaking biblical truth to cultural issues, trying to give people God's answers to the questions that we're asking, God's word on the issues we're facing. So similar to what you're doing and all the various media that God has called you into as well. And it's why it's such a privilege to partner with you in this way. And so we have a daily article, goes out every morning, 5 days a week. I get up about 4 and finish it. It goes out around 5 or 5:30 based on that day's news. And so it's written in that real-time context to try to speak biblical truth to those issues. And then the white papers are available there. The daily articles available as a podcast as well. We have a great deal of video content and then book and white papers. Other people are writing for our website as well. And then we have other brands. First15.org, which is our devotional spiritual resource, Christian parenting that helps parents raise children to know and love the Lord. My wife's Bible study brand, JanetDenison.org, that in the last year under coronavirus has been made digital and has gone viral. It's been fun to watch. And then the pastor brand at pastorsview.org. All that's at Denison Ministries, which is the larger umbrella. If our folks will go there, DenisonMinistries.org, they'll have an entryway to everything I've just described.
So again, just great to have you on the program. But as you go to Denison Forum, there's a matching fund. So I would encourage people to invest in you. First of all, if they don't receive the daily article, that's free, and they should sign up for that. But then if you appreciate some of the facts, figures, and information and great biblical insight, I would encourage them to support you as well. Always a delight to have you in studio, and look forward to the next opportunity.
Kerby, thank you so much. I'm so grateful for you, for who you are, for what you are, and the chance to be your friend.
Jim Denison with us, and let me just mention tomorrow is our weekend edition. Penna Dexter and Dr. Merrill Matthews with us, and we have certainly a lot to cover. But if you found yourself saying, I'd like some more information, we have all of that at our website at pointofview.net. And so as you go there, you'll find my commentary, some take action items, and of course, many of the articles we've mentioned. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for the help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is at Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, at Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.